our press secretary, gave alternative facts to that.
My goal in this deposition was to be truthful, but not particularly helpful.
Welcome to Unspun, the podcast that makes you better at finding the truth. The way people get news is changing. It used to be that there were many reporters who would research stories and write articles, but now politicians and famous people share information directly with you on social media and the internet. That means you find out things fast, but it's up to you to make sure the information's actually accurate. And newsmakers don't always do their part. The temptation to manipulate information is strong. They bend the truth to deceive so that they can avoid accountability, so that they can advance their agendas. When you recognize these agendas, you can sometimes find out what's real. And we're at a crossroads where anyone can share anything online, so it's important to sharpen your critical thinking skills. Finding that deception before it goes viral is pretty much a survival skill now, and we're going to do it together. Let's get unspun. Hello, truth seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of Unspun. In this week's episode, I first want to talk about an insider's perspective on the extensive coverage of the aftermath of Joe Biden's debate performance. Then, we'll get a first look at how people's love for a neat story sometimes gets in the way of truth through something called the narrative bias. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Before I get started, I wanted to shout out Chuck Y. Chuck wrote to me about a particular episode, and I really appreciate people take their time to do that. I do the work to make Unspun for all of you, truth seekers, and it helps me to know what you're thinking, so feel free to reach out at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. Okay, back to it. The journalism business has several publications and organizations that work with, help, and give ideas to working journalists, and one of the best known of these is called the Poynter Institute. Poynter works to make journalism better, mostly through offering training for journalists, but they also publish things about the journalism business itself. And I wanted to share with you something I've read in a column from Poynter that came out the early part of this month. And it's an article by Kelly McBride. Here's how it starts. The Democratic panic over President Biden's awful showing in the debate last week briefly blew back the curtain on the mostly opaque world of campaign coverage. From the moment the debate concluded, journalist after journalist mentioned that their phones were flooded with text messages from sources. Without saying so, most of those sources were anonymous. Within 24 hours, journalists, pundits had declared that the Democratic Party was in crisis and called for Biden to step aside. Now, I thought this article was pretty interesting because I've seen some chatter about how the media were creating and keeping a story about Democratic concerns alive when it just didn't have merit. And there's a couple of interesting points here that are both related to journalism ethics. First is the relationship that journalists have with their sources, particularly in coverage areas like politics, where reporters and politicians and spokespeople that they cover, they're often together most days during a legislative session. They're very close, and it's common for reporters to develop an exclusive feeling relationship. You know, that's that texting access direct to a reporter's phone. As McBride put it in the article, anyone who's been around journalists covering political campaigns knows there is a frequent exchange of off-the-record information via text messaging between sources and reporters. Much of it is initiated by sources asking to pass along tips, as well as get tips from the reporters and otherwise influence the coverage of their candidates. Now, I hope you see big caution signs flashing when you hear this. If the role of journalism is, in part, to keep power accountable, developing this kind of relationship can be really fraught. Journalists are generally aware of this, right? Politicians use access as a carrot to, at least in some way, shape the coverage about them or the issues that they care about. Looking at both sides of the equation, journalists use this feeling of access to get politicians to answer a text or answer a phone call when they need it. But the sign flashes nonetheless. The other relationship, though, is the relationship with you, the audience. McBride notes that although these kinds of off-the-record texting relationships are common, the audience often doesn't know about them. The ethics of journalism, though, do require reporters to defer to being open about sources. When reporters do this, you can make your own judgments about how credible the information is. But in those kind of vibe check pieces that followed the debate, the sourcing really wasn't clear. McBride called it a black box for audiences. She said, I do believe political reporters could be more transparent. Explain the journey. How many text messages exactly? What is the nature of these sources? Why are they texting you? Why are they citing this information but not naming them? For news to be useful, people need to understand how it's made. I agree. In any case, I'll put a link to the original column in the show notes. Now, I'd like to tell you a story. I spent the early part of my career as a professor living in Texas. And people all over the world have a lot of stereotypes about the Lone Star State, right? That everybody wears a cowboy hat, that they walk around with their guns on their hips, and everybody can ride a horse. One of the other things that Texas is known for, though, is being part of what they sometimes call, quote, Tornado Alley. Spring storms in Texas are no joke. And the town where I worked, Waco, Texas, actually had its downtown pretty much destroyed by a tornado in the 1950s. I worked there in the early 2000s, and there were still ramifications from that terrible disaster. That tornado killed 114 people. It destroyed more than 600 houses and 2,000 vehicles, and the outcome was especially bad because it hit right in the city's downtown. And before that, people had kind of believed that the geography of the Waco area made tornadoes less likely to be damaging. A lot of those downtown buildings were not reinforced to withstand that kind of a natural disaster. And there were reports that rubble from that tornado piled bricks from those buildings up 5 feet in the street, with people who survived having to wait as much as 14 hours for someone to find them. Now, if a tornado hits you, it can be amazingly devastating. The town did some of the cleanup by pushing debris from downtown into the banks of the nearby Brazos River. And 60 years later, people who took canoes and paddle boats out on the Brazos knew that you had to wear shoes with a good sole, because if you flipped and ended up in the water, you never knew what you would put your feet on. So living in Texas during tornado season, if you were watching live TV, in the spring, you would be used to getting weather warnings, and they'd either be interrupting your show or running in a ticker or along the bottom of your show. Eventually, if the storms were close, the TV station would break in, and you and your family would be hiding in an internal space in your house like a bathroom or a closet or a hallway because your biggest danger was flying glass. And you'd turn the volume up on the TV as loud as it could go so that you could hear those weather reports from wherever you were. And I remember one time there were tornadoes in the area, and the last thing I heard from the TV news station was the meteorologist yelling, "Everyone in the station, go get in the closet right now." And then the station went off the air. The tornado actually touched down fairly close to where the station was, and that was 4 miles from our house, so that was pretty exciting. But on a typical spring evening, you were hearing about storms that were quite far away. The geography of the area is quite flat in Texas, and because of that, broadcast TV signals reach a long way, and a single news station will cover a very large land area. So you might be getting tornado warnings for a place that it would take you 90 minutes or even 2 hours to drive to in your car. And so a tornado that touched down over yonder might be terrible for the people over yonder, but it would have no effect at all on you. And it's interesting sometimes to watch the news coverage after a tornado would hit. I mean, think about it. You've probably seen this, right? You've seen news coverage of a natural disaster. You'll see a reporter standing somberly in front of a flipped car or a flattened building, something that shows devastation. But what you don't always see is that tornadoes can be extremely local phenomena. The house or the business literally across the street might not be affected at all. But you wouldn't know that from watching the news. The National Weather Service report on the tornado that took the local TV off the air gave a figure of $3 million in damage. And maybe you remember that impact is one of those news values that helps news organizations decide what stories you should see. That giant figure hides the fact that the tornado hit in a business park. So the $3 million didn't represent sad people who were homeless now, but rather a sad mechanic who lost the cars he was working on and a sad Coca-Cola bottler who lost a lot of inventory. And this is because one bias that the media can have is a narrative bias. And this means choosing facts to build an article that makes sense and is engaging. And it's really a continuum. We actually do teach students that an article should have what journalists call an angle. You might call it a point. Audiences expect this. I might call it an article, but you would likely call what you read in the news a story. It can be difficult, though, to find that angle but not force that angle, to look at a set of facts and be able to tell what they mean. And that sets up some chances for deception. So think about those big news events that happen, crises or catastrophes. Here in the U.S. where I am, these are sometimes natural disasters, but they are often mass shootings. And when you hear about those, it can be very frustrating to see the lack of immediate information. Depending on how close it is to you, it can be even more frustrating. But regular media coverage is probably going to leave you wanting. So, truth seekers, what do you do? If you're like a lot of people, you're going to look for alternative sources, like social media posts from people who are on the scene, or say they're on the scene. And these people can have a unique and immediate perspective on what's going on, but they almost certainly have a limited perspective of what's going on. So for example, if you're near the person doing the shooting, you may not be up close to see the impact. If you're in a crowd where people are being shot, you don't have a good perspective on the shooter. Your social media feed may have firsthand and current information, but it's in tiny bits and pieces. It's not the whole story. And that is why the regular media can seem slow to report, especially compared to social media. If they're doing their job right, they're verifying information and also making sure that they're building the correct big picture. And that takes time. It takes time, and it matters because a disparate set of facts can sometimes lead to the wrong sense of the big picture. So let's do a little demonstration. I'm going to give you a set of facts, and then, during the break, I'd like you to think about what story explains those facts. Here come the facts. Fact 1. There's a politician who has a concealed carry permit. That politician is arrested for trying to take a gun through airport security. Fact 2. The politician stated that they forgot the gun was in their bag. Fact 3. The politician was very cooperative with security personnel. Fact 4. The politician is known for advocating for stricter gun control laws. And fact 5. The politician was not arrested after the incident. I'm going to take a quick break, and when I come back, I hope you will have thought of a story that fits those facts. Welcome back. We've got our politician who checked that gun and tried to get it through airport security. We've got a story about a politician who tried to get a gun through airport security. I have 3 stories I could suggest, and I'm going to tell them from the perspective of different audience members. So audience member number 1 might say, so this politician, who, by the way, had a concealed carry permit, totally forgot that he had a gun in his bag when he went through airport security. I mean, seriously, how do you forget about something like that? This kind of negligence is pretty alarming, especially coming from someone who's always pushing for tougher gun control laws. I mean, sure, they were cooperative with security, but it doesn't change the fact that they were so careless. And the fact that they weren't arrested, it seems like there might be some leniency going on here because of their status. If you ask me, this incident just shows a glaring lack of responsibility on their part. Now, this reading of the facts requires some assumptions, assuming the politician was negligent and assuming that the police went easy on them because of who they were. Let's consider another perspective. Person 2 says, this politician, who has a valid concealed carry permit, accidentally brought a gun to the airport. They genuinely forgot it was in their bag. When security found it, the politician was totally cooperative and explained the situation. I think this shows they're actually pretty responsible. Everyone makes mistakes, right? The fact they weren't arrested just means that the security folks understood it was an honest error. Plus, this politician is usually all about stricter gun laws, so you know they didn't mean any harm. It was just an unfortunate oversight. What are the assumptions here? Assuming the politician made an honest mistake and that it was obvious to everyone. Let's do a third. Person 3. This politician, who has a valid concealed carry permit, is a sleeper agent for the gun lobby. He's talked about stricter gun laws before, but he has a really close election coming up and he cannot afford to alienate voters. He deliberately left the gun in his bag, hoping it would get found. He knew he could pull the I'm a famous person card and not get arrested, and he thought the story about it would make him seem more relatable to the gun enthusiasts in his electorate. He could always say, oopsie, I forgot. But now everybody knows that he carries. What are the assumptions here? It was on purpose. The politician was making a political point, and he assumed it would not have consequences. So the point is that it's easy to take a disparate set of facts and draw different conclusions. And it takes time to do a responsible job of verifying and looking for patterns. Audiences are impatient. And hypotheticals aside, we saw a real example of this with the attempted assassination of Donald Trump. In the face of a small number of facts, the candidate was giving a speech, there were gun sounds, the Secret Service pulled the president down, people in the crowd were hurt, and one was killed by bullets, and the president stood up, fist raised to the sky, blood running down his face. The social media speculation ranged everything from his opponent ordering a hit on him to the candidate having arranged himself for someone to shoot him just a little bit so he could emerge as a hero who faces death for the voters. Interestingly, a later Washington Post analysis noted, quote, the frenzied post-shooting news cycle was a gift to foreign adversaries who have spent years developing a digital strategy to leverage crises for political gain. So those conspiracy theories we've been great at developing here make really good fodder for disinformation campaigns, and there's some evidence that that did happen. If you follow the aftermath of the shooting, you can see the media's unsatisfying attempts to make a story out of a shooter's motivation. It just stays unclear, but here are some headlines that they've tried. These are real headlines. Guns are woven into the life of shooter's hometown. Trump shooter Thomas Crooks emerged from a lonely America. From honor student to the gunman who tried to kill Donald Trump. Trump rally gunman, quote, didn't want attention in school, classmates said. Investigators say Trump rally gunmen searched 2021 Michigan school shooting mirroring other mass shooters' patterns. Thomas Crooks appears to have posted ominous message before shooting. Thomas Crooks searched for porn before shooting Trump. All of these are fitting a small set of facts to try to tell a story. But perhaps the best headline was this: a 20-year-old's perplexing place in the catalog of American gunmen. So what's our takeaway here? Even in a crisis, accurate news takes time. Social media accounts are tempting because it makes you feel in control of the world again, having put the story into a place where, even if it's horrible, you can kind of understand it. But slower news should mean higher quality news. I recommend sticking with those mainstream news sources. You can look at them on social media, and the more local they are to the event, usually the better the information they share is. Thanks for getting Unspun with me this week. Unspun is a production of me, Amanda Sturgill, and is a proud member of the MSW Media family of podcasts. Send me your thoughts and ideas about trickery in the news on Gmail at TheUnspunPodcast@gmail.com. I even write back. And find this episode's show notes and more information at TheUnspunPodcast.substack.com. Want to learn more and get smarter? Check out my book, Detecting Deception: Tools to Fight Fake News, which is available on Amazon or your favorite online bookseller. And until next time, stay sharp, everyone.